But the problem with my work for archaeology is that it pulls the rug out from underneath the feet of the whole edifice of prehistory that archaeologists have invented, basically. I'm saying, look, guys, you have missed. I think I'm not, by the way, claiming that I am necessarily 100% right. I'm not a fanatic. What I'm trying to do is to introduce debate into the narrative, introduce discussion into the narrative, consider possibilities that archaeology may not have considered. And the conclusion that I come to is that the house of history, built by archaeologists, stands on foundations of sand. That the story of the origins of civilization is missing an incredibly important chapter. And that chapter took place during the last ice age. And the last ice age roughly ran from 120,000 years ago until about 11,000 years ago. It's a very long period. Archaeology certainly has knowledge of the last ice age, but it does not have sufficient knowledge to rule out the possibility that one of those hunter-gatherer cultures in the world during the ice age set off on its own track and began a kind of social evolution very rapidly, became inventive, started to create technologies, started to explore the world, started to understand the motions of the stars in the heavens. A complete grip on the nature and place of the Earth in the cosmos was achieved, in my view, much earlier than archaeologists accept. Not 6,000 years ago, not 7,000 years ago, but way back during the last ice age, perhaps as much as 50 or 60,000 years ago. And my work has been focused on looking at the foundations of the house of history and trying to show that those foundations are very flimsy indeed. The response of archaeologists to my series was that, as though they know that they seem to claim that they have sufficient evidence to rule out any possibility of any kind of advanced civilization anywhere in the world until about 6,000 years ago, when Sumer in Mesopotamia emerges. And I don't believe archaeologists do have enough information to rule that possibility out. I'll state it plainly. I don't think they're lying. I think they're deceiving themselves when they say that they have sufficient information to rule out the possibility of a lost civilization. And why don't they have sufficient information? One part of the problem is the way they look at ancient structures and the paradigm, the framework into which they fit those ancient structures. For example, the Great Sphinx of Giza. Because the Giza Plateau is regarded by Egyptologists as a creation of the fourth dynasty, the three great pyramids are thought to be the work of three pharaohs, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaura, in the established framework. Therefore, it was naturally assumed that the Sphinx, you can't date a stone monument like the Sphinx. There's no direct way of dating it. But it was assumed and taken for granted right from the beginning that it was a work of the fourth dynasty as well.
What did they base that on? Do you know what that assumption was based on?
It's based almost entirely on context, number one, that it's sitting there on the Giza Plateau with the three great pyramids in view. But it's also based on a couple of documents. One of them is the so-called Dream Stela, which sits between the paws of the Sphinx. It was not created at the time the Sphinx is supposed to have been made. It dates to about 1200 or so BC. It's the work of Thutmosis IV. And in that stela, Thutmosis records that he had cleaned up the Sphinx, that the Sphinx had been covered with sand, that he had removed the sand from the Sphinx. And then he put this stela up between its paws. It still stands there to this day. He put the stela up between its paws to record what he had done. Now, on that stela, until about 50 years ago, some of the lines are broken, but in one of the lines appears the single syllable Kaf, which arguably is the first half of the name Khafre. It was not surrounded by a royal cartouche, but nevertheless, there it is, Kaf. And because of that single syllable, which no longer exists, by the way, it's weathered off the stela now. Because of that single syllable, Egyptologists concluded that the ancient Egyptians, that the ancient Egyptian pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, Khafre, to whom the 2nd pyramid is attributed, had been the builder of the Great Sphinx. In fact, the stela does not tell us that. It just had the single syllable Kaf. It could equally well have been saying that Khafre was an earlier restorer of the Sphinx. We don't know what it was saying. And as I say, that syllable isn't there anymore. Secondly, there's another stela from the Giza Plateau, the so-called inventory stela, which states clearly that the Sphinx was already in position in the time of Khufu, the predecessor of Khafre. So Egyptologists have selected from these two stelae, and they've chosen the one that fits their view of the past best. But it's not truth, it's an opinion. And because their framework says that the Sphinx should belong to the 4th dynasty, they have forced the evidence to conform to that. That's how they see it. They're not considering the possibility that the Sphinx might be a much older monument, which was restored during the 4th dynasty, but which long predates the 4th dynasty. And that's where the geological work, initially it was the late great John Anthony West who drew attention to the extraordinary vertical weathering patterns in the trench around the Sphinx. And then this was later supported courageously by Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, who is himself a geologist, and who has concluded that the Sphinx, after it was built, was exposed to about 1,000 years of extremely heavy rainfall. And it's a plain fact that you did not get heavy rainfall of that sort on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago in the time of Khafre, when Egyptologists would like the Sphinx to have been built. You have to go back nearly 12,000 years to get those kind of rains on the Giza Plateau that could have caused that weathering. So from a geological point of view, the Sphinx is much, much older than Egyptologists believe it to be. And yes, it has the head of an Egyptian pharaoh, but that is very simply explained as a recarving of what I and my colleagues believe was originally a leonine head, that the Sphinx was originally entirely a lion, and that its head was recarved during a restoration campaign in the 4th dynasty around 4,500 years ago, was recarved into the head of a pharaoh, not necessarily of Khafre, but the head of a pharaoh. And we can tell it was recarved because although the Sphinx is a majestic, proportional work of sculpture, the head is extremely small by comparison with the body. And this is what suggests to us that the head of the Sphinx was recarved as part of a restoration campaign. And this is creating the confusion that makes Egyptologists connect the Sphinx to the epoch of 4,500 years ago, when actually geology says that it's 12,000 years old. So that's one issue, is that structures may be hiding in plain sight, which archaeologists simply refuse to recognize as older and won't look into the possibility that they're older because it contradicts their framework. And there are many such structures around the world. I would reference the incredible megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru, for example, up in the Andes near Cusco. There are many examples of this around the world where structures may have been misunderstood because archaeologists impose a pre-existing dating framework upon them. And then the other issue is, how much of the world has archaeology actually investigated? How much of the world has archaeology actually studied? They give us the impression that if they can claim that there is no possibility of a lost civilization during the Ice Age, they should, in order to make that claim, they should have done a thorough investigation of the whole world. But in fact, they have not done so. First and foremost, in the countries where archaeology does happen quite regularly, it very rarely happens because of a targeted search. It usually happens because a road or a dam or some other piece of engineering work is being built, and archaeologists are asked to investigate that site to make sure that no ancient archaeology is going to be destroyed. So the discovery of archaeological sites is somewhat random in that sense, even in countries where a great deal of archaeology is conducted. And then secondly, there's the whole areas of the world that have received very little archaeological attention. 6 million square kilometers of the Amazon rainforest, for example. Very little. There's been some archaeology done there, but minimal. Most of the Amazon rainforest remains untouched and unseen by archaeologists. Some new developments are taking place using LiDAR. I'm very interested to see where they lead us. But at the moment, the Amazon is a kind of black hole in archaeology's understanding of the past. The same goes for the 27 million square kilometers of land that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. That's roughly the size of Europe and China added together. Yes, there is some marine archaeology, but until very recently, marine archaeology has primarily focused on shipwrecks from the historical period and has not paid a great deal of attention to the prehistoric period. There are some new developments taking place in the North Sea between Britain and Europe. An area called Doggerland has been discovered, which was certainly submerged at the end of the last ice age, but it's just beginning. The vast majority of the areas that were submerged at the end of the ice age have never been studied by archaeologists at all. And yet I and my photographer wife Santha, with 7 years of diving, following clues by local fishermen and divers, looking at areas that we knew had been inundated at the end of the last ice age, we found dozens of man-made structures underwater. So if we could do that on the small and limited budget of individuals, what could archaeology achieve if it were to take seriously the investigation of the flooded continental shelves? And another, which it has not done yet, and another example is the Sahara Desert, roughly 9 million square kilometers of the Sahara Desert. Again, yes, some archaeology has been done, but again, it's minimal. So I don't think that archaeology is in a position to say that they have enough evidence to rule out any possibility of a lost civilization. Quite the contrary, they don't have enough evidence at all. They haven't looked in enough places. In the places they haven't looked, in the places that they have looked, they haven't looked in a targeted or organized fashion. And generally speaking, I don't believe archaeology is in a position to rule out the possibility of a lost civilization of the Ice Age at all.